Welcome to the third of my triptych of films about the Logic Sampler, as it's now called. Today I thought I'd do a deep dive, a tour for people like you and me, veterans of the EXS 24 Mark II, which now doesn't really have a name. Dave, I've called it, but I believe the people at Apple would like us to call it Logic Sampler. How do I know this? Well, I've had the real privilege of a 2-hour tour of this sampler by the people who made it, the people at Apple. This isn't going to be a biased film, but I certainly thank them for it. I thought I'd make a piano, but I thought I'd purposely make it in a slightly disorganized and shit way. And what better way to start making a recording than to make a bad one with a bad recording device? One of these. Sorry, I'm not Apple bashing today, it's just not designed to record pianos into, as far as I know. So here is a list of the different sections which you can jump to straight away. And apologies in advance if you're a kind of noob coming to the Logic Sampler. There's probably going to be a lot of assumed knowledge, but I will try and kind of lay out each section as best as I can. But before I start the tour, I think it's worth talking about the quick sample and auto mapping functions that have been written into EXS, Logic Sampler. A means in which Apple hopes for us to be able to create sample instruments incredibly quickly, intuitively, as part of the music making process, not as a kind of adjunct to it. I loaded the voice recorder stuff into here. That's not the right voice recording, so here. And I noticed that when you take an M4A onto Logic, it creates a WAV. Am I correct there? Yes, so there's a WAV. Okay, so basically you can see we've got C1, MF, and F through D2, E3, F sharp 4, and C5. So let's wang it into RX7, which is our preferred noise reduction software at Spitfire. So what I'm going to do, instead of dragging it onto an audio track here, I'm just going to drag it, not down here, but here, onto the track header, and you'll see a whole bunch of options come up. Quick sampler optimized, drum machine. I'm going to use the quick sampler optimized. It's probably having a little think. It's almost like we've got the synthesizer and modulation section of EXS here and just a single wave editor. Now I'm going to go slice. It reminds me of a combination of recycle and the strip silence function within Logic. I'm going to chop that rubbish off there because that's just me rubbing my thighs in glee and expectation. You simply then go to sampler, and cleverly it holds those samples in mind and slings them into Dave for you, kind of how many of us used to strip samples and import them in the past. Let's look at the auto map functions to see how close we can get to a usable sample instrument without doing the grunt work. So now let's go auto map and go by using pitch detection. And you can see it's placed stuff around. Not as I'd expect it, to be honest, but... Okay, so let's have a look at what it's accessing. Okay. The lower samples, as you can imagine. Now what's happening up here? Okay. So that's interesting. You can hear it's a very quick way of making an instrument. It's used a bit of AI to create this that isn't particularly in line with how I would have laid it out, but it's very quick nevertheless. Now there's another way you can load stuff in here, which is if we go to the NR file, if you go up to the top here, you have your 4 different options, I believe, which is more reminiscent of how it used to be when you used to load zones into EXS. So you've got your chromatic, you've got a zone per file. So if I've already chopped it up, then it'll arrange those in a single chromatic zone and then split at silence, which we'll look at in a minute, and then optimized zone per file. I imagine, well, we'll have a look at that in a minute once I chop it up. Imagine it may automatically map those depending on some criteria and then zone per note. So let's use that for now. Oh, look at that. Now that is interesting. So it's found that and that. But it's had difficulty. It's had difficulty finding these 4 samples here. So again, let's go and dump it in and let's use this split at silence. Okay, so again, this is looking good. Okay, the only one I don't think I want is me rubbing my thighs at the end. Okay, now what we're going to do is auto map using pitch detection, which again, interesting. Okay, so that's the wrong way around. So again, quite easy. Just remap mirror velocities. And again there. Now this one here. Okay. It's picked up a pitch there and has placed it. Good. So what I'm going to do is just fill gaps. Isn't that pretty? And then I'm just going to push these velocities up a bit. Again, I'll take you through how this all works in a second. And let's have a listen. It's interesting, if you listen here, I'm playing these bang at the same time. The strip silence function isn't the same as the kind of snap to transient function that I did in the video linked above. So I'd have to go in and just tighten those up by hand. And I think one way of doing that is, in fact, using the transient function there. So if we go snap transient, now what you're going to get is a super bitey sound. It will be cutting out a lot of that important stuff, which is the big debate that we always have at Spitfire is where a sample starts. This, you'll find, is where the note, the actual pitch starts. This is where that all-important character of the piano is. Great. Again, I'd say quite bitey at the top, and I'd prefer some of the actual noise of, you know, the piano making the note as opposed to just the note that comes out of the piano, if you know what I mean. Okay, so that's some of the automatic means in which you can quickly, you know, someone go, can you quickly sample this? So let's rewind a few steps and go into the individual modules. But before I do that, I want to speak about the context of samplers per se, because I think Apple are going to create a quiet revolution when it comes to sampling. You see, for me, samplers are a box that record audio and spit it out. Individual files that would then be mapped to different points in the keyboard. Those were your samples, so to speak. And gradually, that technology got more complex, not in the sense of how it recorded stuff and spat it out, but all of the stuff that you could do between recording and spitting. Ways of editing the sample. Hard drive space was precious, so you'd want to cut it down. Now, with EXS 24, they did away with the sampling bit entirely. You basically recorded stuff into your DAW, not into the sampler, and then the sampler became kind of a little bit more computery, more file management-y and folder organisationally. And that, I think, is what was the real appeal of the EXS 24. It brought all of the boring stuff about computers, made us, I don't know, collect sounds. Now with the new Logic sampler, it's done away with the editor entirely. In fact, it stopped thinking about us taking individual samples, but rather it's more of an audio management tool. So where the architecture of computer samplers are concerned, usually the smallest kind of component is the sample, is the piece of audio. And what Apple have done is that they've taken it one step lower than that, the zone. So you can have one piece of audio, your sample, as we've kind of grown to know them, and you can have several zones that pick different bits of that sample. So in this new, slightly more, but only slightly, more modular environment that is Logic Sampler, let's start with the zone editor, which isn't a hard editor like the sample editor used to be. It's more of a what to do with the address points, the ins, the outs, the loops, how Dave basically treats your audio. So let's start again, but this time with a properly trimmed set of samples, one file per note, which I've trimmed by hand, including that all-important piano action before the note sounds. And then instead of cutting hard to those sample starts, I drag all the samples back by a quarter note on the grid before the tireless task of titling by hand here. Let's load audio files. Oh, this feels nice and familiar. Open. Okay, so it's not giving me the option of mapping them to the root note in the name, so we're going to have to remap, automap, using root note from audio file names. Okay, well that's, I think, quite tasty. Now, what I'd like to do is remap to root notes, and then you can see at C, D, E, F sharp and the C. I'd like to make that maybe 109. Now, linked above is a film about why I think samples sound better when you pitch them down. And it's the reason why no Spitfire samples, you'll ever find them pitched up. And we rarely record things chromatically. The only time I'll pitch up is from here. Okay, so this is when I'm going to start basically the tour. So I'm going to go through each module until we get to the Overlord Sauron synth module. So we have all of these modules here. Some of them can be resized. So you can see here, you can unselect them so they disappear. And when the synth module is the only module left on screen, it automatically expands to reveal the detail settings, which you can also access by hitting detail here. Another nice navigation tool is to option click the modules to isolate those and get them fully expanded. This is our individual sample. Maybe start with MF C1. Again, options. So across the top, you've got various zoom options there, expand. And I think this one, if I'm right in saying, will always expand to the length of the sample. So if I then go like that, that's not going to do that. So that's kind of quite a handy little tool of really zoning in on stuff. You can expand and contract this window with the up-down motion on your mouse here. So in the main window, we have the zone start, and you can snap that with zero crossings. So if we go right in here and go here, you'll see it looks like it's snapless, but if we go really zoom it in, you'll see that basically it'll only let you cut it to a point where there's a zero crossing. And let's look at this transient. And this is where it detects the note starting. See, for me, that is just that little bit tight. And if we just look here, I'd be more inclined to go in there. Now, these two handles here are fades. Here is your zone browser, so you don't have to go into your mapping editor to edit the next zone. Just simply select here. And you can physically load different audio files into this zone. So what we've got is we've got the audio file, and it can be a bit of one audio file that lots of different zones use, or it can be one audio file per zone. But the lowest level of the sampler is a zone, and the zone is just simply an address marker to go and grab something from this WAV, starting here, ending here, and it gives you a little bit of help there of the length, and you can do some fade-ins here. You can play the piano as a one-shot, so this is more in drum machine parlance. And carry on till it finishes the sample. Again, I wouldn't use that on anything but drums. And then reverse, I think, is self-explanatory. And this little bow tie here is basically like a flex time. It won't kind of speed it up and slow it down to give you the different pitches. It'll basically pitch it up and pitch it down, so the length will remain the same. So let's take reverse off. You'll see if I press this here, just look at the speed this is traveling. Now if I go down an octave, slower. Now if I do this, the speed will remain the same. You hear some little artifacts creeping in there. You also have a tempo interpret button here, which is great for loops. So if you bring something in that is running at double time, or you want it to run at half time, this is where you do it. And then finally, we've got our loops here. Now there's no loop currently playing. So let's do a forward loop. And you can see just a nice, easy way of doing that is with these handles here. But obviously, you can control them there. And then we've got a crossfade of nothing at the moment. So now, it's very difficult to loop a sound that's going like that because you're going to feel the cycle. So one of the fun ways of doing a loop is to do a reverse there. But also what's really cool is more of a ping pong technique. Let's make this really long here. Lovely effect there. So no loop. Let's take that off. Fabulous. So that's the zone. And as I say, you can move through all the different zones there. Let's look at mapping. You've got 3 windows in here. So you've got your groups on the left. Now, groups are basically, I guess the best way of describing them is folders containing zones. And just in the way that you can treat each zone differently, you can treat each group differently, whether it be the way that you select it or the way that group is panned or the volume, all of those different things. So this is the group mapping editor. So click on the group and you've got, as you saw earlier, the different mappings that we did. Now, what's new about Dave is that you cannot overlap zones within a group. I believe it's backward compatible so that any overlapping that you had before, you'll be able to do. But I think what they've done is they've decided to do this new function, which they didn't have a name for, and I suggested they should call it zone wrapping. And it really is, if you've ever been a sample developed or made samples, it does stuff that's pretty incredible. So groups on the left-hand side, and whatever group or groups that you have selected, you'll see how the samples are arranged or mapped on the right by pitch left to right along the keyboard and by velocity up and down. So if I go here like that, it automatically moves that zone away there. If I go like that, and let's maybe try copying that into there. You see it's already automatically created all of these zones, which is pretty nuts. Now, what happens if we go autofill? That should be fun. Fill gaps. Whoa. Cheeky. And you can remap. So it's all just on the white notes. Pivot on corners. Where have you gone? So everything's in one line. And swatch them all around there. Remap, fill gaps. There we go. So let's undo that. All sorts of remapping options there. Definitely a very intuitive way of quickly moving stuff around. So here are the groups that are selected that you can see within the mapping editor. I'll duplicate some groups momentarily, but then you can go into the way in which the group behaves. So its volume, pan, And you can maybe select groups via velocity and also create maybe release triggers. And with all of these windows, if you go into list columns, you can go show all columns. There's all sorts of different settings that you can give an entire group. So every zone in that group behaves in a way according to all of these different settings. You can put your round robins, you can enable by bend, enable by a controller of your choice, etc., etc. Let's get into our zones mapping editor. Much loved list view. See, you've got your loop points that we programmed before, which were just 0, don't need those anymore. And what's great about the list view is that you can affect multiples. So we can go 300. And where this is going to be useful is the beginning of the note. So we're running at, if you recall, I dragged the samples forward by a uniform amount, 1/4 note at 120 BPM. Select all, make that 2400 for everything, 24,000 rather, and then boom. So here's a great example of why I'd want to go into the zone and have a look at what's going on there. And this is maybe where it's handy to go to 0 crossing. Great. Back to mapping. So the zones mapping editor enables you to adjust any anomalies you have, whether that be sample starts as we did before, or indeed tuning, volume, individual zones, multiple zones that you select, or indeed you can select all zones that can all be done together in this simple list view. So returning just to the top level of the mapping module, you have a header here which displays some very basic overall settings for whatever group you have selected. And then as you go in, you can go into much greater detail for the group, how that folder is controlled, if you will, and then the individual zones which you can change individually or several or all at the same time. So that's basically what I would call the sampler section of Logic Sampler, of Dave. Now we move on to the modulators, the modulator matrix, and the actual synth section. And I think the key differentiator of this section compared to, say, Contact is everything within this section largely affects the entire instrument. First thing is to look at is the modulators. These are either envelopes or are low-frequency oscillators, which are just waveforms that control other things. So you can delete these. You can't delete the first one because that is the amp. Without it, you don't hear anything. So you can see the shape there. The attack is very sharp. We'll go like that. And then decay. The point it decays to, the sustain, and what it does when it releases. That's got a kind of nice natural sound. There's loads of different ADSRs available with basically different kind of node points in, but I'm just going to keep to the standard ADSR. So immediately I can hear that the notes that are playing this layer here are really loud. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to duplicate that group. So this is F, this is MF, and what I'm going to do is just take out the Fs there, and take out the MFs there. What I'm going to do is turn down the top group. Even less. So that's the amp envelope, but also you can create some oscillations. So let's add LFO1. You can add a whole bunch, delete them by just getting rid of them here. and let's have them do something. So this is the modulator matrix, which is how you route your various different modulators to whatever the target is. So basically, we've got our source, none are listed here. Let's say our LFO1 there is going to control filter cutoff. I think it'd be good to switch that filter on. And let's adjust the amount. You'll see that the speed now you'll hear that a different LFO is triggered for each of the keys, so they all kind of cross phase. So if I put it into mono, it'll all move together. Now with key trigger on, every time I hit the key, it'll start at that point. Whereas this is just free running. And I love this little function that you can actually fade it in. Now let's turn it into a square wave. Key trigger. We can also make that sync to tempo. So not only can you get an envelope or an LFO to modulate a target, you can also control it via another LFO, another envelope, or indeed stuff like key velocity or a controller like your mod wheel. So finally, the ultimate top level section, the synth section. Everything you change here will change the whole instrument. Coarse tune, fine tune, your filter section, volume, and pan. So we switch the filter on at the very top section, which is our synth section. And the thing that's new about this bit, the huge selection of new filters, which we've got here, but also you've got two of them, which can sit kind of next to each other. So we've got our low pass filter here. Let me put a high pass filter, a creamy one there. But also we can blend them. And again, maybe if we create another LFO with a square, let's do that mono, key trigger, LFO2, target, filter blend. And then let's also maybe if we just go back to the group section, so let's go back, option to that. We've got our two groups here. What if we were to duplicate both of those and make these left and make these right? What I'm actually going to do is pan these quarter to, pan these quarter past, and then just a cheeky little trick, if you recall, pull these down, pull these up, 110, and we should get a more stereophonic sound with the wrong velocities playing in the left-hand ear. I've used the LFO here as an effect, but other than the filters, there are no other effects, so to speak, no reverbs or flanges or choruses. And I think this is where there's a divergence between what Contact does and what the Logic sampler does, because I think what the guys at Apple want us to do is for the sampler to be part of the DAW, not to be some kind of bolt-on. It's like comparing Logic to Pro Tools. Logic is made for composers and music makers. Pro Tools is made for engineers. And I think it's the same as the Logic sampler, or Dave, as I've nicknamed it, and Contact. Dave is made for music makers, for composers working on the fly, not wanting to interrupt their process creating sample instruments, whereas Contact is far more a kind of dev tool. The interesting thing about the Logic sampler is there's something wholly un-Apple about it, and I'm enjoying this. In fact, if I was to say it was anything, it's even more EXS-y. There's just something so dump it in and have a go about it that I enjoy. It encourages people to make sounds of our own and for that to be part of the music making process, for it not to be kind of cordoned off into its own environment, but to be part of the DAW workflow. I think that what's happening here when I talk of this quiet revolution is a real divergence away from the scrolly, wheelie sampler mindset that we're possibly still in within the realms of Contact and other sampler plugins. I look forward to seeing how they develop it, but hope it doesn't change too much for the next 20, 22 years. So romantically, I can continue to remain a loyal disciple of the EXS24 Logic Sampler Dave format. I do wish it had a name. It is the EXS that drew me away from Cubase and into the Logic Ecoverse, and it is the ease of use with the EXS that drew me away from composition and into this rather extraordinary journey I've been on as a sample developer. So long live Dave, long live the Logic Sampler, long live EXS24 Mark III. There you go, I said it, gave it a name.